and that is the issue of congressional insider trading. There was a 60 Minutes report recently, and now some legislation that's getting some attention, the Stock Act, which would prohibit essentially this sort of insider trading loophole for congressional members. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, if at all, and do you support the Stock Act?
Well, I haven't thought the issue completely through. I didn't see the 60-minute report, but it seems like if you had the right kind of people in Washington, there wouldn't be even the suspicion of a problem like this. But without knowing about this in detail, I can't imagine why the members of Congress wouldn't be under the same laws that you would be under on insider trading. So a lot of times when things like this come out, there's a lot of grandstanding goes on. You know, they come up and all of a sudden we're going to have a fancy piece of legislation. So I haven't made up my mind about legislation. But obviously, if we have access to information, we benefit by it. I think that's a pretty serious offense. But in some ways, that's the culture of Washington. When you think about individuals who have been in Washington and they know the system, and then they leave Congress and they make millions because of this insider information and trade and become lobbyists. So I think the culture of big government, so often in bed with big business, is a very dangerous situation. But if there are some rules and laws that we could pass to restrain the congressman from doing this, we should certainly look at that.
If I could just follow up on that, obviously one of the biggest stories nationwide right now is the Occupy movement, and sort of leads me to ask you about this, because I think this congressional insider trading issue is just one of many examples of the sort of things that this movement is opposed to and would like to see changes made with regard to. So I'm just curious, do you support the Occupy movement? And if so, why or why not? What are they getting right? What are they maybe not getting right?
Yeah, I think it'd be wrong to say that if you support a movement when it might have 6 factions to it. It's sort of like it's an all or nothing thing for the Tea Party movement. That actually started during our last campaign 4 years ago, but that wouldn't mean I would all of a sudden say I support everything the Tea Party stands for, because that has changed a whole lot, and there's a lot of outside influence. The same way with Occupy. But in general, I'm very sympathetic. Some people are pretty harsh on their criticism. Well, all they need is to take a bath and get a job. But who in thunder took their jobs from them? I mean, yeah, there are some lazy people out there. There's no doubt about it. But the people unemployed, that's a little bit different story. And I think you should be careful on criticizing just everybody for not having a job, because I see that as a consequence of bad government policy. You know, the government's responsible for the business cycle. Free markets doesn't create the business cycle. The Federal Reserve and Congress creates the business cycle, and therefore the unemployment is a result of bad economic policy. So if they're complaining about that, I'm all with them. If they're complaining about some rich people who have ripped us off, I'm all with them, because I didn't vote for any of the bailouts. I've been trying to expose the Fed on how they bailed out people for decades, and they dealt with $15 trillion, bailed out banks and rich corporations. They won't tell us a thing about it. And there's some of my supporters down there complaining about that too. You know, we need to know more about the Fed. So anytime corporations and banks and others rip the taxpayer off, they have a legitimate complaint. But that is mixed in with people who resent anybody who have made some money. And I don't like that. I think people should be productive. They should be rewarded and not punished. So the two have to be separated out. But I have a lot of sympathy with them, and I'm not going to be jumping on it and say, you know, all they need is go get a job, because I think I understand the business cycle a little bit better than some others.
Congressman, you were here 4 years ago, and you finished with about 7% of the vote. And so what, in the primary, and so what is it that has occurred in the intervening 4 years that encourages you to think you're going to do much better this time?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about the conditions of the country have changed. You know, 4 years ago in '07, in one of the debates, I was saying that the recession had already started, and the other Republicans weren't willing to say that because they'd have to be critical of their own party. So they, mocked that. But we were actually in the recession when I said that. And then we had the collapse, which we've been talking about for a long time. So the economic policies have just fallen in my direction, in that it's been my big concern, and the explanation of the business cycle and how we got in this mess, and the warning about the danger of the huge deficit. There's an explosion of debt now and deficits, and nobody knows what to do. And I've been trying to get some common sense in Washington with both parties about why we don't have to have continuous warmongering and getting involved in one war after another. And now the American people are with me on this. 70% sometimes in a poll are saying it's time to get out of there. We don't need another war. We need to get out of Iraq and out of Afghanistan and come home. And during this period of time, the last 10 years, we've added $4 trillion worth of debt just with the wars going on in the Middle East. So I would say the American people are very much coming in this direction, and that's why I think my numbers are so much better right now. I mean, I'm very optimistic about the difference between now and 4 years ago. It's the difference between night and day. And I think most people realize the country's in a lot worse shape and needs to do something.
So, obviously, you've been preaching finance reform of a sort for decades. What do you feel in the Dodd-Frank Act works or doesn't work?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't work. Regulations can't compensate for bad policy. And if you have bad congressional policy and bad monetary policy, and think, well, yes, we're going to create easy credit and low interest rates and have all kinds of programs, and then say, well, if we watch the regulators, we're going to prevent these problems from cropping up. So you have to deal with the cause. Dodd-Frank's is the Democratic version of Sarbanes-Oxley. You know, we had Enron, so they say it's a lack of regulation. So they passed Sarbanes-Oxley. That added $1 trillion worth of expenses onto the business community at a time when we were moving into a very, very difficult decade. And Dodd-Frank's going to do the same thing, add another $1 trillion. And then they say, wonder why business people don't want to hire people. And then you add on, the medical changes, in Obamacare. I mean, this is devastating. Business people can't make their proper calculations. So I think it's very damaging to the economy, and I don't see a recovery unless we change our attitude about what the federal government should be doing.
Could I just follow up with a clarifying question there? Is in the situation that Sarbanes-Oxley was meant to address, and then Dodd-Frank was meant to address, in those situations, do you see it inappropriate for the government, for Congress to have done anything, or that it did the wrong thing? And if it was the wrong thing, what should it have done?
When it comes to regulations?
In those instances.
Well, government has a responsibility, not necessarily the federal government. When Enron went bankrupt, it wasn't the SEC that warned us about it or took care of it. They didn't do any good. It gave false reassurance. It was a moral hazard. Oh, the SEC's there, and they fill out the reports, so they're solvent. This sort of thing. It's false reassurance. But the fraud that was committed was obviously a governmental function, and they were convicted of fraud under Texas state law. Mm-hmm. So the regulations failed, fraud laws work. When it comes to the collapse in 2008, they ignored the market, and they said, well, we have to bail them out. So they use congressional funds, taxpayers' funds, the Federal Reserve, to bail out their friends. And they do that at the expense of the taxpayers. All the derivatives and the mortgages and all the worthless stuff was bought up by the taxpayer and the Federal Reserve and transferred over. And then the middle class lost their job and they lost their houses. So the government has a responsibility, but when you give it to it, if you're careless and give them too much power, that power is taken over by the special interests, by the banks and the corporations. So they made the money when the bubble was being blown up, and they got bailed out. It's a terrible system.
So would there have been an appropriate regulatory response that should have been taken that wasn't taken, and if so, what was
Yeah,
that? Or
well, it is. It would have been an encouragement and no bailouts, and say if you're bankrupt, you're bankrupt. You can't dump your bad debts onto the people. It should have been handled more like it was handled in 1921 when they had the sharpest drop with that depression. They had the sharpest drop in prices and wages and everything else. It lasted a year and it was over, and nobody even knows about it. But it was a bad depression as a consequence of the inflation and the malinvestment of World War I. The correction had to come. But then it happened only 1 year. But once you get interfering and saying, well, we can't allow the mistakes to be taken out of the economy, liquidate the debt, and get it out of the way, all you do is you prolong it. And this is what we're doing. So we're into 4 years now. It's going to last a long time unless we change this attitude that we don't keep bailing out all the special interests. And they're getting ready to do again. Bernanke just the other day, when they talk about the European problems, he says, I'm watching it carefully, and in order to maintain stability, I'm going to be there. He's going to print money at will because he doesn't want the banks to fail. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It's a dollar phenomenon, and he will print at will, and he will intervene at will, which will destroy our middle class. And that's what happens when we allow a government or a central bank to destroy the value of the currency. You destroy the middle class. This is historically known, and the evidence is all around us. The middle class is getting poorer. People on fixed incomes, their standard of living is going down. You can't keep up with what the Social Security beneficiaries are getting because the value of the money is going down. So as long as you have this belief that government can, print money or spend money and take care of people, and not look at the source of the problem, which is the artificial nature of the business cycle that is created by the Federal Reserve. No, all you do is you prolong the agony. We did it in the Depression. See, the Depression was different in 21. And the Depression lasted until 1946, essentially, because it lasted all through World War II. And that's when we got economic growth again. Japan follows this economic theory that you prop things up and you don't, the banks held a lot of stocks and they keep everything at artificially high levels, and you don't have the market sorting things out and say what it's valuable. We don't know what these mortgage derivatives are worth. They may be worthless, but we buy them up, and we create the money to buy them up, which devalues the currency. Then we say, oh, we need more regulations, and it causes massive confusion, so our business people go overseas. So, no, you need regulations. You need the government to act properly. You need to understand property rights. You need to understand contract rights. You need to understand bankruptcy rights. You need to understand why special interests can't control our government, whether it's through the appropriation process. And we need to know what the Federal Reserve is doing. I mean, this idea that they can create $15 trillion and we're not even allowed to know. I mean, this is crazy. And $5 trillion of it went to overseas of the credit they created, bailing out other companies and countries and central banks. And Bernanke, just like I said a few weeks ago, assured us that he would be watching it. What he's saying is he's going to take care of the system and forget about the people. And when I point this out to, whether it was Greenspan or Bernanke, I say, what right do you have to decide what the interest rates would be? He said, well, that's my job. This is what I have to do. So he makes them artificially low. Low interest rates are supposed to make everybody happy. It makes the banks happy. But what if you happen to be a saver? What if you have? What if you're skittish about the stock market and you don't want to be involved, and you're in retirement and you buy CDs? What right does he have to say they get 2%? Instead of the market might say he gets 6 or 7%. When I ask him that, I said, well, you just can't make everybody happy. You can't take care of everybody. But the market isn't so judgmental and serving special interests. The market is going to help the people who are frugal and save and take care of themselves.
And so the market can be left to its own devices?
Well, no, I explained how the market should be involved. You know, you shouldn't permit fraud. You should have bankruptcies, and you should follow the laws in your contracts. That's an important role for the government, and those laws are much stricter than the government, because if you say that there's going to be regulations, say you argue the case for banking regulations to protect the people against banks doing stuff. Well, who writes the bank regulations? The banks, you know. So the bankers become the lobbyists, and they really write the regulations. If you want, if you're dealing with the drug industry and the medical profession, it's the drug companies that come in and write the laws, you know, and because they are the lobbyists. So it empowers those people with money to do it. So this, the regulations of the free market, much stricter, and not so directed toward the special interests controlling. This is why the rich got bailed out,
Well,
and the poor suffered.
If we can just segue out of finance here for a second and stick with regulation, we have 20 miles from here a nuclear power plant. Its license is due to expire in March, and the owner of the plant is making efforts to have that license extended. The regulatory agency that oversees that plant and other nuclear power plants in the country, the NRC, is believed by some to be so close to the industry that it's in bed with it. Do you have any views on that particular score? First, regarding the NRC's regulatory position and integrity, and then secondly, segueing to nuclear power itself.
Well, I think the market should determine these things, and I think the people in New Hampshire should make the decision on why can't they decide whether there's danger or not. So I would think that'd be fine. But I have a sympathy for nuclear power, but my opinion should have no value, because what should really count is if you're going with the regulations of the marketplace, you say, well, should we subsidize it? Well, the market says no. Somebody else says we should subsidize because it's good. No, I'm saying, no, you don't do it. It has to act on it. Should it be insured? Well, we'll find out. The market, if it's too expensive, that means it's too expensive and too dangerous to do it. But if you say, oh no, if you allow the regulatory agencies to come in and have the special interests come in and say, well, we think it's safe, we'll take care of the insurance and we'll take care of the waste products, and on. You never get an honest number for what the cost of energy should be. And it's cost and safety, and the market has to determine whether who's safe and who's paying for it. But if you get the taxpayers involved and the regulators involved, the special interests will control it. But I think nuclear power should be very competitive if they can do it safe and get no benefits, no subsidies, and provide cheap, safe energy. Happens to have a pretty good record, you know, on safety, you know. So if you look at the number of deaths from nuclear power compared to hydrocarbons, you know, it's rather minor. But I think it should all be done by trying to get a free market pricing. It's sort of back to the finances. If you don't have free market pricing of your money and your interest rates, you distort things. If you don't have free market pricing in energy, like right now, energy prices are distorted by subsidies to corn because of the special interest. And you say, well, it's important because of environmental reasons and blah blah blah. We have to do ethanol. So all of a sudden, the people who are going to benefit, they write the regulations. I want the market to decide. There's no proof that ethanol from corn is going to give you a better price for energy. They may use up more hydrocarbons making the ethanol. And besides, you might be able to get more ethanol out of sugarcane, or you might be able to get more ethanol out of hemp. If you did that, maybe the market would sort this out. But as soon as you get the government in there and saying, okay, this is what is good, we are going to subsidize corn, we're going to use 10% ethanol, 20%, it serves the special interests, and people, you won't find the right price. And it'll be a distortion, and somebody's going to benefit at the expense of somebody else. So I want the market's pretty smart. Believe me, the market is a lot smarter than the politicians I know. The bureaucrats I know, what do we know about the best thing for you in New Hampshire on what the energy should be? And Bernanke doesn't know what the interest rate should be. And since the regulations are inevitably controlled by the special interests who are going to be regulated, it backfires on us. That's what my contention is.
Can I just circle back to the nuclear issue, but just to make sure I understand that I'm understanding what you're saying. So, if the market were to determine how this would work, you've mentioned they need to be safe. So would that come about because the free market would require or would lead inevitably to a sufficient insurance market that would then impose safety standards?
They could do that. That would be one way.
Or are you saying that, or should the government be saying what the safety?
I think because it is so significant, I think you could argue there's a clear and present danger when you're dealing with nuclear materials, and there'd be no reason why your state couldn't have some regulations on that. But I think you sort of touched on something that is so important, is the cost of insurance. Tells you, for instance, this is the whole thing about living on the Gulf Coast. I live on the Gulf Coast, and windstorm insurance is too expensive. So we who want to live on a Gulf Coast, not me, but they say, oh, well, let the government insure it. So what do? We build our houses on the Gulf Coast, and they get blown down. And if you don't live on the Gulf, you have to do it. Mm-hmm. But if it's insurance, what if the government was out of it, and it comes in and said, well, to build your house on the beach, it's going to cost you $umpteen. Holy man! I'm either going to go uninsured, or I'll build my house stronger. I wouldn't do dumb things. I wouldn't build there because the government will take care of me, because they're going to insure me. So the insurance rate is very important, and that's the way it would be with a nuclear power plant. If they won't insure it, and it's too dangerous, I don't think we should have nuclear power. But I don't think that would be the case, because I think that's my personal opinion. I think nuclear power is pretty safe. Just think, we've had nuclear submarines since 1950. And they sleep next to a nuclear reactor, and they've never had an accident. So it's pretty good evidence. It's not like it's so dangerous. But I would let it sort out. I wouldn't use subsidies and prop up the energy companies so that they can make more money by not paying for their insurance.
And just to clarify one thing, if the safety end of it's going to be left up to the states, how do neighboring states handle that issue?
How do you what?
Neighboring states handle that issue. So, for instance, the plant we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think that's important. Most of the time, if you're on a border and you're next to another state, most of the time you can get to another state, and talk to each other. But if not, if there's an argument, the federal government would be involved. Yeah, I think the same way on other environmental things too. Like if you have a river, or if you have a power plant and you're putting all your smoke's blowing in the wrong direction, and some other states suffering. No, if you can't settle it agreement between the two states, then there'd be a role for the federal government.
When you talk about letting the free market will resolve it, it's smarter than the bureaucrats. It's smarter than the government.
The ones I know, but smarter than the politicians too.
So then theoretically, the mortgage industry should have done that, but didn't in every case.
Which mortgage industry?
So we had subprime mortgages being approved that probably shouldn't.
Because they were they were insured by the government. That was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and federal home loan mortgages. That's all distorted by the government.
Okay. So, but where I'm going, I guess, with that is, now you talked about the government having a responsibility, and that fraud laws will help keep industry and finance on
People
track.
they don't have free reign.
Should there, we have a new financial regulatory agency, consumer protection agency. Is that a good thing?
No, you mean for your state?
No, the federal.
Oh no, I think it's horrible.
Should the government not be involved in protecting consumers?
Yeah, by protecting the market, because the consumer tells you, everything. The consumer buys and sells, and prices are set by the consumer. And if I'm the businessman and I lied to you, that's committing fraud. If anybody's hurt, you have recourse. But for a bureaucracy in Washington to do it, I think all you're going to do is scare your businessmen to go someplace else, because and if they are successful, they're going to be controlled. The lobbyists will be by the people who are being regulated. So that's the real fallacy. I mean, theoretically, it sounds ideal and all, but it never works that way. Your safety in your drugs, for instance, it sounds like a reasonable thing. You want safety in your drugs, but the FDA and the drug companies are in bed together, and they squeeze out competitions and build up their monopolies, and they love government medicine because they make more money. The insurance companies and the drug companies, whether it's Democrats or Republicans reforming the medical care system, these corporations run the show. They support this because the government doesn't take it over. It's the corporations that end up taking over. So, it's well intended, but I think it always backfires on us, and that the people you're wanting to regulate end up writing their own regulations.
So in that particular case, would the reasonable alternative be no FDA?
I think so. Because I think they've done more harm than good, because sometimes it might take them 25 years to allow a good drug to come onto the marketplace, and the rules and regulation inhibits the options of the physician to use drugs for anything other than not approved by the FDA, which means it slows up research and the cost goes up. And then when it's approved by the FDA, guess what happens? If you're on the inside track of that, today I approve this, I'm the FDA, today I approve this drug, tomorrow their drug company's value, their stock goes up 50-fold, just because a bureaucrat made this decision. So it's a protection of the corporations is basically what it is. But people weren't dying from bad drugs before we had the FDA. I mean, it didn't happen. There'd be other agencies that would do this, and there'd be no reason to assume that all of a sudden the drug companies have it in their interest to give you a bad drug.
Well, I'm not sure what thalidomide fits into there, but it's hard to prove a negative. But are you assuming that there are no bad drugs? Excuse me, there are.
There's plenty of bad drugs, and the FDA's permitted a lot of them to get on the market too. How many bad drugs are on the market now? Did you ever see a PDR? They're about that big, and probably half of them are useless. But if it's FDA approved, and what does the FDA do when it comes to alternative or natural products? The FDA and the drug industry keeps them off the market. A natural drug product, alternative health care, freedom of choice, it is obstructed from those making those free choices. So it's there to protect the drug industry. So they very often do exactly the opposite. I believe in free choice on picking alternative care, rather than having it licensed through the FDA and these drug approvals. It delays, it costs so many. This is one reason why drug costs are so high, because it goes through these years and years and years of litigation getting approval, and that's a source of making drug costs much higher in cost.
So how did we get to this mess? Let's just stick with FDA or go with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But how is it that this body of burdensome regulations was allowed to develop? Is it private sector, parts of the private sector finding ways to protect themselves, or what?
I don't know. I haven't done a detailed history of exactly this, but my assumption would be that there'd be a lot of well-motivated people and say, well, we need these regulations to help the people and protect the people. But those individuals, the companies that are involved, immediately leap to it and take over and find out how they can keep out their competition, no matter what industry it is. Whether it's the housing industry, housing insurance, it's always to squeeze the little guy out and protect the big industries. It never serves. Competition serves the competitor who's trying to compete with big industry. And I don't like to see government protecting big industries and big corporations.
if we could just maybe switch up to another topic. Something I wanted to ask you about is Roe versus Wade. And there hasn't been seemingly a real significant challenge to that law in quite some time. But as president, you have pledged to attempt to pass the Sanctity of Life Act, if I have that right, which would define life as occurring at the
Well,
moment
no,
of
I
conception.
think, no, the We the People Act is the one that challenges Roe versus Wade.
Okay. Regardless, the name of it, is this a battle? I guess I would say
On Roe versus Wade?
that you're truly prepared to embark on if in
Well,
fact you get
I have a position on it, but if that were the only issue, I probably wouldn't be running for president. I'm trying to save the economy from total annihilation, and I'd like to stop war, and I'd like to produce an environment where we have prosperity. Some of these other things, like if you take the abortion issue, I just want it to be returned to the states and get the federal government out of it, one way or the other. No laws of prohibition or mandates or finance or anything. Just get them out of it and try to get away from this thing, because that's the way it had been up until 1973, and but now this rises up in the ladder. In a scheme of things, I think if we're pro-life, we ought to be talking about war and torture and assassinations, and what we ought to be talking about is why we have probably 22% of our people unemployed. That's it. That's what we should be caring about if we care about life, and we need to care about the economy, but we got to understand what it's all about. But the Constitution is very clear when it comes to acts of violence, and I personally believe abortion is an act of violence because I'm responsible taking care of a human fetus, and if I do harm, I can get in big trouble. So to me, but it's a difficult subject and it's complex. And the state is there to take care of all other acts of violence. If you go out and rob somebody, or if you injure somebody, you commit manslaughter, it's always a state issue. Why are we making this a national issue? I just as soon leave it alone. But I do have a position on it. But like I say, my issues, I first ran for Congress because of 1971, the breakdown of the Bretton Woods Agreement, ushering in this 40 years of a disastrous economic period that we're in the midst of a correction, and it's a long way to go. And my determination that we waste so much resources on war. It's the waste of resources. Just think of the $4 trillion of debt that we spent being involved in wars that we didn't need to be involved. 8,500 Americans died, 40,000 severely injured, hundreds of thousands suffering from illnesses, and the drain on the economy. Then we wonder why we don't have enough resources for taking care of child health care and the elderly. And we use the Social Security money up to do this. So I think those are the right to life issues that I'm concerned about. But I'm concerned about the Roe versus Wade. To me, that was just part of the movement that states don't want any responsibility. We can't take care of our problems. It's the federal government that do it. They have a money machine. They have the taxing authority. But if you look at the coming together of our 13 colonies, that is not what was intended. And I think it's a bad move going in that direction, because if you care about people and if you have a humanitarian instinct, you have to be concerned about how do you create wealth. And right now we're destroying wealth. Our country's poor. We have debt. We have $15 trillion of debt, $3 trillion of foreign debt. We have to borrow everything we get from the Chinese. I mean, that's what we have to be concerned about if we care about people. But the more regulations, the more printed press money, and the more dependence on the federal government, the poorer the people are going to get, and the more wars you're going to get. Because once you reject the concept of the Constitution and saying, well, yeah, I know the government didn't say we should be able to run the school system, but we'll do it, we'll just ignore the Constitution. So you go to war without a declaration of war. So our presidents go to war anytime they want. And they don't even ask us, they ask the United Nations. And now we just put troops over in Australia. Why do you want to pay money to send troops to Australia? Oh, because we need to fight China. I mean, they're getting ready to have a trade war and a hot war with China and get involved in their battle over their sea lanes over there. property rights and disputes that they've had going there for 30, 40 years, and we're getting involved. So I'm just trying to get this thing back in perspective and you know, get some priorities.
You mentioned, last time I checked, the deficit committee wasn't going too far. You know, they got to the end of the day to get it done, so who knows what's
Yeah,
happening.
okay.
But you said that the committee had an impossible task. And what it really should be focused, what the job at hand here is not to carve small bits of money out here and there, but to reshape the responsibilities of the federal government. Now, aside from just talking about that right here, how do you actually make that happen as president?
To get it back in order.
Yeah.
You have to change the attitude of the people on what the role of government ought to be. It's not difficult if you have a proper role for government. But if you think the proper role for our government is to police the world, go into nation building, and that we have the authority to start preemptive wars, no. As long as the American people do this, that cost is going to be so high, you can't do what I want. Nor can you do it if you believe that the federal government is able to provide any need for anybody that ever needed anything and forget about production. So the proper role of government is there to provide the environment, the conditions where people have the incentive to work and create wealth instead of chasing wealth away, have a sound currency in these things. So if those attitudes aren't changed, it's impossible. What I'm saying, it's not impossible if you change your mind about, and what do we have to do? It's not so much as you change your mind and invent something new. All we have to do is go and look at something we take an oath of office to uphold. It's so clear. It's small and short. It's Constitution, but nobody in Washington cares about it.
Why not?
Because the people want more stuff from Washington than can be provided under the Constitution, and they want to be in office, and they've been reelected. That's the reason. And they get reelected. But the big difference now is something is stirring. They're sick and tired of the Republicans and the Democrats, and that's why you have Occupy groups. That's why you have Tea Parties groups. That's why you get anger on the streets, because it's ended. The bankruptcy is here. We're up against a wall. That's why I said, under these conditions, there's no way that committee is going to do it, no way that Congress is going to do it. So we have two choices: either go my way, or this thing is going to come very much unglued. You're going to have a financial crisis that will make 2008 look like a picnic, because the currency crisis that's coming and the breakdown of what's happening in Europe, I mean, this is going to be horrendous. So that is why it's so important that we make this decision. This is why I'm begging and pleading people to look. It's not brand new. It's what made America great. It's a free market. It's a free society. It's individual liberty. Let people do what they want. Don't have the government telling us every single day and every single minute how we should run our lives. And the government is just involved in every little bit we do. We have no privacy left. We have this Patriot Act that just takes away all our liberties, and there's no really economic liberties, no personal liberties, and we have this runaway spending and involvement overseas. Every single day there's another war getting started. The wars are going to expand in the Middle East. Right now it's Syria, it's Iran coming, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, and Egypt, and things are getting very, very chaotic. We don't need to be in the mess of that. We need to be taking care of ourselves.
If somebody were to fly some planes into some buildings in the U.S. today, somebody who's in another country, would you go? And you found out who that person was, would you go after that person?
Sure.
And bring the military along with them?
Well, I do whatever. I voted for the authority to do exactly that when we went after the Al-Qaeda.
And so there are military engagements that are...
Of course. That's one of the very few explicit requirements in the Constitution to provide for national defense. So that's what you must do. But you should. What's wrong, though, is if you use that as an excuse to do something else, that you wanted to do and is unrelated to somebody flying into our buildings. Iraq had nothing to do with flying into those buildings. And yet that was just the excuse to go in there. Nation building of all these countries that had nothing to do. Matter of fact, it's making our conditions much worse. Matter of fact, Al Qaeda is now in Libya. There's chaos in Egypt, and we bribed the Egyptians for all those years to behave themselves, and then their government gets overthrown. And the wars and the conflict in the Middle East are expanding. I mean, we literally have driven the Iraqis into the hands of the Iranians. The Shiites are, pretty much, getting along better. So all that killing and destruction, and now there's more Al Qaeda in Iraq than there was before we started. But the end result is that the Iraqis are going to be much closer to the Iranians because they share the Shiite religious beliefs.
You've mentioned this failed sort of foreign policy several times before, and you mentioned about if you can find a specific bad guy, as Jim mentioned, if we had somebody that crashed planes into a building here today, and you could sort of identify who that person was that was responsible, or that entity that was responsible, that you would go after them and possibly employ military power. But in the past, you've also indicated that you believe that 9/11 occurred as a result of foreign policy that was being practiced by the United States prior to this, so prior to the attack. So I'm wondering what
I said it's an influence.
Right, and can you just sort of elaborate on that and talk about how you would maybe use diplomacy or other methods to address some of the issues that led up to that?
And of course, my views are shared by many others, like our Department of Defense, our CIA, the 9/11 Commission. Paul Wolfowitz made a very strong statement about that. And he says, now we better get our base out of Saudi Arabia. It had been there for 15 years, and he admitted our base in Saudi Arabia was a strong incentive for bin Laden to recruit al-Qaeda members. So, I mean, I'm not inventing these things. That is just the way it is. And you had one. You had what would I?
That the foreign policy sort of that we were practicing instigated 9/11. What different approach would you take?
Oh, okay.
That led up to that.
The different approach. Well, I wouldn't be in the Middle East, so I wouldn't have had bases in Saudi Arabia. And you talked about diplomatic things, what you can do. Well, there's diplomatic things that we could do, but also there's, what the example I used is one of the worst. See, nobody wants to talk to the Iranians. That's evil. You can't do that because they're bad people. But we talked to the Chinese and we talked to the Soviets, and they had nuclear weapons. They killed hundreds of millions of their own people. I was drafted in 1962 and during the Cuban crisis, and I was pretty glad Kennedy called up Khrushchev, and he says, and they said, well, I have missiles in Cuba because you have missiles in Turkey. And Kennedy says, okay, I'll take them out. So they had a deal, and the whole thing, and they took them out of Cuba. So I think we should practice some diplomacy, but the foreign policy should change because George Bush had it right in the year 2000. He says we should not have an arrogant foreign policy, or they will strongly disapprove of this what we do, and that we shouldn't have nation building and policemen of the world. So, that's the approach that we should have. The foreign policy should change. You should be willing to talk to people, and I mentioned the fact that we have nearly 12,000 diplomats. What's wrong with using a couple of them? I mean, before you go side to war, and this whole idea that they say that nothing is off the table when it comes to Iran, except diplomacy. Nuclear weapons are on the table, but diplomacy is not. They won't talk to anybody. So I think a little bit of common sense, but bringing our troops home would make us so much safer.
If you're president, sworn in today, and Israel, obviously one of our top allies, felt compelled for whatever reason to make a military move against Iran, what then would you do? Do you feel like it sort of forces your hand, or what would be your response to one of our top allies.
Well,
making
we
a
don't
move
even
in
we
that
don't even
direction.
have a treaty with Israel, so I don't know what forcing my hand would do. I mean, when they did that against Iraq in the early '80s, I was in the Congress, and there was a resolution to condemn them for it, and I didn't vote for it because I think Israel inadvertently has made them put themselves into a corner because they depend on our money, so we're their boss. If they want to bomb somebody, they have to ask us. If they want to have a peace treaty with somebody, they have to ask us. So they've lost their sovereignty in many ways. So if they want to bomb Iran, if they ask me what my advice would be, I say it's liable to like committing suicide because it makes no sense. But if you do it, that's your business. But to assume that they should do that and I should send these young kids over there and die for that, no, I don't think so. It's it's so unnecessary. I mean, an attack on Iran right now would be. I mean, there's a split in Israel over this issue. Their intelligence sources are strongly opposed to it. A lot of them are. And our generals, there's some very well-known generals, are very much opposed to something like that. And I think it would be very devastating. I certainly, if I were president, I certainly wouldn't want to participate in any of that. But I wouldn't assume control over other people. I think in a lot of ways we've jeopardized Israel because, we sort of bribed Mubarak. We've been giving him a couple $1 billion. This is about 78 or 79. And it didn't work. I mean, it worked while he was getting the money, but finally the people hated him enough they threw him out, and now now there's going to be a government much more hostile toward Iran, and I think it makes it very unsafe for them because of that, because we prop up dictators. Someday, I'm sure that they'll get rid of the king in Saudi Arabia. That's a ruthless dictatorship. I mean, it's everybody's bad or worse than the Iranians. But we give, they're our best friends because they have oil. But someday, see, what we do is we divide the people against their government when we prop up the government. We're doing this in Pakistan right now. We bomb over there trying to kill some bad people, and then we have mistakes made and we have collateral damage. It upsets the people. I wonder why. And so they get mad at their government because we're friends with their government. We give money to their government. So there's an example where we both pay the government to be our friends, and we're bombing, trying to kill some bad people in their country, killing innocent people, and they're getting angry with us. So that just stirs up resentments in the world. The one other thing on what could be done, and I've talked about this right after 9/11, is that declaring war is pretty difficult when it's a band of criminals, that can do this, and not a government. So if that would happen again, and we knew there was a group, 200-300 people, we should think about, I'd like to get people to think about a letter of marque and reprisal, which they used in our early history when they would give authority to private sources and others to go after individuals like that, rather than declaring war against a whole government. Right now we've declared war against a tactic worldwide, which means that our government can go to war anytime, any place it wants to without congressional approval, unless that's changed.
If we can return to a matter of domestic concern here, you've talked about the importance of letting the marketplace have its freedom to move. The subject here is campaign finance.
Campaign what?
Campaign finance.
Finance?
And campaign finance, the disputes are on the one side that donations should be made freely without limit to as many people as one wants to make. And the arguments on the other side are that by allowing such practices, the rich will rule and all others will not. So is there I hope I've defined it clearly, is there a role for government regulation of campaign finance?
Not unless you change the First Amendment, because you have a right to petition your government, and if you limit, let's say you think a lot about the First Amendment and you go to Washington and you want to spend $1 million to protect your First Amendment rights, and I want to limit it and say you can't do it, I think I violated your right to petition the government. So I would say yes. But the problem is, if you have unethical people in Washington who are susceptible to the bribery of big donations, that's a problem. Get rid of those people. But you say, no, that'll never happen. Then you have to get rid of the system that provides a government, gives us a government that can give out so much. It has so much control, so many benefits. The regulations, I'm going to regulate this guy against this guy, put him out of business to help him. So as long as the government is involved in the redistribution of wealth, taxing one group and bailing out somebody else, you're going to always have that incentive. The regulation is just, of the way you spend money is just very superficial. I mean, I've been there a long time, and I don't, nobody bothers me, you know. Nobody comes and asks me for anything, and nobody gives me any money because they know where I stand. So I think the problem is inherent in a system and the kind of people we have. It's a system where the government is way too big and they have too much power. But to say that because the system is flawed, that I should regulate your right to defend what you believe in would be wrong. You should be able to spend any amount of money you want to defend the part of the Constitution you believe is worth saving. So I don't think that we should. You know, and some of these provisions are that, okay, let's say I'm a corporation and I'm spending more money than you might think I should, you know, lobbying Washington and influencing politicians and all. Okay, let's say all these corporations can't do it. Well, what about the corporations in the media? What if you're on a TV station? What if you're on a newspaper? I mean, all of a sudden you get more power. So I'm taking my opportunity to spend money down in Washington. You take that away from me. But if I have a TV station, all the information comes from that corporation. How are you going to regulate that? Oh, they say, well, we're going to regulate time. You know, we're going to make you have balanced time. Yeah, sure.
Well, that's been rejected long ago.
Yeah, so that's, but they keep talking about it. They want to come back. So what you do is if you deny one group the right to lobby and petition the government, you might give more power to another group, and that wouldn't be fair.
So you talked earlier about needing to change the expectation of what the government does or should do. And that if you were president, that's how you would make the changes. But what, concretely, if you're elected president, you go to Washington, you've still got essentially the same Congress, I mean, plus or minus however many people may change in this election. You've still got the guys who are taking money from special interests. You've still got all the lobbyists. You've still got millions of Americans who may not want to change the things you think need changing because they get from Washington. They get welfare, they get Social Security, whatever it might be. So what concretely can you do to make those changes?
Well, the plan I've written out and talked about on the budgetary change, I mean, you do have to have everything I've ever talked about, I have a transition for. You know, I want to work from one group, even on monetary policy. I don't want to close down the Fed, even though I want to end the Fed, but I wouldn't close the Fed down one day. I want to legalize your right to use constitutional money. If you use gold and silver today, you can go to jail. So I want to legalize that. I want to make sure it's legal always for you to have private schools if you want to, and never have the government prohibit you. So I always want to have competition. In medicine, instead of moving in the direction of forcing everybody into a government system, I want you always have the right to opt out of it so that there is a transition. Education is that way, medicine like that, monetary policy like that. But how do I get there? Well, first, if elected, the sentiment is certainly going to be different than it is today, and you will have a type of bully pulpit because the people will have endorsed what I'm saying. There will be new members of Congress. There were new members of Congress last year. The conditions are going to get different, and you do have to work hard. You'd have to work and persuade people. Out of necessity, they're going to have to do something because they're going to, otherwise, you know, we're going to have this horrendous crash. So what you do in order to, I want to cut $1 trillion first year. First year, $1 trillion, because I think the debt is a problem, bigger than anybody else. Nobody in Washington thinks that debt is a problem because they've been taught for 70 years that deficits aren't bad. Liberals and conservatives says deficits don't matter, but they do. And the debt is the reason we can't get growth again. So I want to cut $1 trillion. You say, where are you going to cut it from? Well, I'm going to cut 500 from overseas spending, 500 billion. And now, where should I get my most of the support there? From liberals. It won't be the conservatives. So, and I also want to cut departments here in the country and get another $500 billion. But in doing this, is the only way I think you can save the care for the indigent, the poor, for medical care, and the elderly. Because we've robbed them blind. There is no money. The Social Security money has been spent. It's been spent in these deficits, in these wars. So if you do that, yes, you could work your way out of it. You could take care of the people who truly needed it. But you can't do it if you keep, doing these things. So I'd have to have coalitions. Nobody, you won't get everybody to agree with everything I'm saying, but why can't you get coalitions? Conservatives would endorse these cuts, liberals would endorse these cuts. Hopefully they'd both endorse civil liberties, and the protection of individual rights and privacy and these sort of things, and move in that direction. But I'd be the first to admit it. It's not going to be easy. All I know is if you don't do something, the other alternative is not good. It's not good at all.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to leave it to you. I'd like to let you start off with a comment on what the President Obama, what he has done that is good. Just pick one or two things.
Let's see. I was asked that question before. I had a little trouble. Then I came up with something. Not very much, but there wasn't very much that George Bush did good either. So if you're picking on anybody, no, government's gotten bigger. The spending has gotten worse. The wars have gotten worse. Protections of civil liberties. I might go. Oh, I know. The one thing I voted with him on was getting rid of with No Child Left. Let's see the military, gays in the military. So I supported him on that, and that was a protection of civil liberties, don't ask, don't tell program. But basically, no, I'm not running against, I bet you've never heard me say it. Well, I guess I could, but a lot of people are, running against Obama. Well, I'm running against a system that had got off track many, many years ago, because we have gone in the wrong direction economically. We don't have any respect for civil liberties, and we have a foreign policy that's a disaster. We've been doing it been nearly 100 years. We've been drifting down. But we met a point 40 years ago when we said there would be no limits on deficits and no limits on printing money and no limits on the size of government. And that was the last linkage of gold, the dollar to the gold standard. And all you have to do is go back and look at any economic chart. They go along like this. Debt, size of government, bureaucracies, regulations, the whole works skyrocketed because there are no restraint on the politicians. And the politicians know that the best way to get reelected is come in and say, look, what do you guys want? I'll do anything you want. I'm going to vote for it. I vote against nothing because my responsibility is to deliver the pork to my district. And they got away with this for all that time, but it's ending. It's all over, and the Tea Party people know it. The people on the streets know it. The people who want more stuff, they know it because they're getting very worried. And that's what I run against. It's a philosophy of government. I believe that the limitation of government power in our Constitution is good. I believe that markets work better than government planning and intervention and welfareism and warfareism. And this is something that is the mistakes have been bipartisan, and I think that. We'll have to make a decision. We don't have any choice in it. We cannot maintain the status quo, which in the way we have been for the last 30, 40 years. We're going along, and our standard of living has stayed about the same, but it was all on borrowed money. Yeah, but we're much poorer than anybody realizes. People are just overwhelmed. optimistic about things the way they're going, because in spite of it, there's a lot of young people I talk to and a lot of college kids I talk to, and they know exactly what's going on, and they don't like what they're getting. They say, "Oh yeah, but didn't we give them low interest, loan of money so they could get a college education? Hasn't that been wonderful?" Yeah, give them a college education. The costs skyrocket. The quality of education goes down, and they don't even have a job. They know there's a problem. I tell young people they can get out of Social Security, even with my program that I designed. 25 and under, get them out and work our way out of this thing. But you can't do it with the current belief that government is all things to all people. It's just illogical. You just can't print wealth with a printing press or a computer. That is a fallacy, and we're seeing the end stages of a 40-year experiment that never has happened in the history of the world. We have never faced a worldwide financial crisis like we've had now, because we've had globalism and global currencies, but never have we had a fiat paper currency that was the reserve currency of the world last for 40 years like this, and we're seeing the climax of it. I hope to make a difference.
Congressman, if I could just ask one thing. You're very passionate in your views, and you seem to be as equally critical of both parties. Given the importance you attach to your views, if the Republican Party doesn't nominate you, would you be continuing your campaign afterwards?
No way. I have no plans to do that. But it's sad. It's sad because one of the reasons why we're over in the Middle East is because we want to, because we're an exceptional nation, our exceptionalism, we want to go over there and tell them how good we are and how wonderful, and that they can have elections. We do that, we die, we go broke, and sometimes they have elections. If they don't come out the way we want, we stick it to them. We just totally ignore them. And yet here at home, we don't have real democracy. I mean, if you do come to the conclusion, which many Americans have, there's no difference in this state. Obviously, there are more independents than Republicans and Democrats. Separately, most people are independent because they're tired of the parties. But if you go into a party other than Republican and Democrat, you can't get on ballots. You don't get interviews at newspapers. You don't get in the debates. At the same time, we do this overseas, and then we look at the way we treat competition here in politics. I think it's a sad story.
We'll have to do a tape change if we continue.
I've actually drawn the close here.